Γεια χαρά σε όλους. Καλώς ήρθατε στη δεύτερη μέρα του WordCamp Greece 2021. Σήμερα έχουμε τη χαρά και την τιμή να έχουμε στο workshop την Daisy Olsen. Θα μας παρουσιάσει και θα μας μιλήσει το πώς θα κάνουμε extend τον καινούριο block editor του WordPress, ακόμη και αν δεν γνωρίζουμε JavaScript. Εάν έχετε οποιαδήποτε ερώτηση μπορείτε να τη γράψετε στο chat ή στο Q&A και κατά τη διάρκεια του session εμείς θα φροντίσουμε να βοηθήσουμε την Daisy να σας απαντήσει. Daisy, the stage is yours.
Thank you. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen and then I'll introduce myself.
Yes.
All right, so thanks very much for joining me today. I hope that this information that we're going to go over today, while it's a lot, I hope that you'll find some ways that you can use it in your work. I'm really happy to have a chance to present to WordCamp Greece. Normally it would be a travel process for me to get to where you all are located. And so this, well, you know, silver linings of the world situation, I guess, is that new opportunities open up. So my name is Daisy Olsen. I am a developer relations wrangler with Automatic, and I've been working with WordPress as a user, as a site builder, as a developer since around 2007. So it's been a long time. I've been working full-time in the WordPress space in one way or another since around 2010. And one of my favorite things that I have the opportunity to do right now is to talk with site builders and plugin and theme developers about the block editor and what you can do with it and how it can improve workflows. So in this session, we're going to go over basically 4 ways to extend the block editor. One of them is kind of like on the edge. It's more of a user feature, but it helps to bring it in to avoid confusion, basically. So, all right, so let's go ahead and move ahead. So in today's workshop, the 3 main ways that you can extend the block editor are with block patterns, which is the newest of the 3 options as of WordPress 5.5, so just less than a year it's been available. Block styles, and block variations. And all 3 of these things have some similarities and differences, and we'll go over what that looks like for you as a developer, where you are at in your kind of skill set, and which one will work best for your clients, because there are a lot of differences. So we're going to start, though, by looking at reusable blocks, which is the user-oriented feature that's somewhat similar to these 3. And then in between each of the sections, I'd like to open up for questions, because there's a whole lot of information to cover. And I think it might be easier if we separate it. And then at the end, we can take some more general questions or questions about when you might use each of the 3 options and in different areas. I hope that we can have some kind of live demo-y kinds of things. So it's like you call it out and I'll try to build it sort of thing. We'll see how it goes. We've got a pretty good amount of time. So hopefully we can kind of have a little bit of fun with it. So let's start before we get into the official extend the block editor features. Let's talk about reusable blocks. So sometimes they can be a little confusing when you compare reusable blocks to block patterns, because before block patterns, there was kind of a hack or a workaround that a lot of people would use to sort of create what is properly now a block pattern. So let's go ahead and get into that. So a reusable block is a block or potentially a group of blocks, some kind of container block with blocks inside of it that are saved that allow management from a central location. So what that means is you take your block and you save it as a reusable block, and then you can use it in different places across your site. It becomes a new tab in the editor, which you can see in the little screenshot here where it says blocks, patterns, reusable. Once you've saved one reusable block on your site, then that tab becomes available. And then you'll be able to access any reusable blocks that are saved on that site. And they are created much like a post. And you can edit them after they've been created, and any changes made to those reusable blocks will change everything across the site. Everywhere that reusable block was placed, you would then change that content. So they're good for things like if you had a call to action that maybe you wanted to update the text for, but you were using it in lots of to get granular placement within your content. Maybe you throw in a call to action here and there, or maybe you have a sponsored message that you need to add to the end of your post content, but only for certain cases. Then you could use this reusable block, place it in there, and then if something were changing, you needed to update the copy there, you could do it and have it propagate across the whole site. The closest thing we had before the block editor to this would probably be in core, would be widgets. So you could have a text widget and then pull them into the sidebars across your site, and then anywhere that widget was in use, it would or where that sidebar was in use, rather, it would update that content. So this is a little different in that it's in the post content rather than in a sidebar widget, but some of it is similar. So let me go ahead. I'm going to switch my screen share over to a WordPress. Let's see if I can find it here. All right, I'm going to have to do it this way, I think. Okay, so hopefully, I'm not confident that you guys are seeing the same thing I am. So just give me 1 second and I'll switch something around. All right, so can I get some kind of confirmation that you can see my WordPress site?
Yes, Daisy, we can see your site.
Great. Okay, perfect. Okay. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and create a new post on the site. It's a pretty fresh site. There's not a whole lot here. And what I'm going to do is create a reusable block. And in order to have a reusable block, like have multiple blocks, one of the blocks has to be a container of some kind. And there are quite a few container blocks in the block editor. Group is a simple one. It just kind of wraps all of your blocks into a group. Columns is another one, and others. It's a kind of a, if you can add blocks inside of your block, then that's a container block of some kind. So I like to use a group block. One thing is that anytime you have like content together and you to keep it together, putting all of the blocks for that type of content together in a group block means that you can move it around easily. So that's that's kind of just a tip for using the block editor in general, but it's important for reusable blocks because you're going to be doing is you're only converting the outer block to be the reusable block, but along with it, it will take everything that's inside of it and save it there as well. So I'm going to go ahead and just create something. I'll give it a heading. And then maybe I'll give it a button. And then maybe I could give it some kind of a paragraph. And then I could apply any kind of styling that I want. Let's say I wanted to, we'll get to styles. That's one of the things we're going to go over. I can change the style of this block, can change the heading. I can maybe make the text bold, and I could center everything. And then if I go to the outer block, so up in the top toolbar is the outline or list view. I want to select the group, and let's say I want to put a border around the group just so I can see where it all is. I could even give it like a gradient background. So these are all just things that you can do with the block editor. But what we're going to do now is in the group block, you're going to use the options in the toolbar and then click add to reusable blocks. And then that happens sometimes. I have not been able to figure out exactly what causes this to happen. So, but now that I've created one, I'm going to go a different way in. I think this is it might be something that was fixed in 5.7.1, which the site has not been updated to yet. So I'm going to go back into the post again. And in the main options at the page level, I can go to manage all reusable blocks. Or since I have a reusable block on this site, if I go to the main inserter on the left and then click reusable blocks, then there's a manage all reusable blocks here. And then you can see that some stuff that I've created in the past is here. I'm going to go into this for team member block pattern. And you can see here I have a reusable block created. I did this in order to create a block pattern, and we're going to use this again later for that purpose. But now I could actually go in and change this to, because if this were a reusable block, I wouldn't want boilerplate content here. I would want the content that's going to actually show up on the front end of the site. So, but I can make changes to this, and then if that block pattern were placed on a site, then it would be managed from that central location. And they do WordPress kind of hides this away a little bit. It's not something that shows up in the sidebar, but you can get to it when you're editing a post or a page, either from the main options, or if you already have something, then from the Reusable Blocks tab. So that is the basics of reusable blocks. And then we're going to talk about how they differ from block patterns, and we'll get to that in just a second. But while we transition into that, this might be a good time for questions related to reusable blocks. I see one question: in a multi-site installation, are reusable blocks available in all subsites, and who has access to create reusable blocks? That's a good question. So in the multi-site installation, I think no, because it's content on one site. It's a post type that is saved to a single site. So the reusable blocks would not be available across subsites. But block patterns, block variations, and block styles could be if the code that powers them is available on all of the sites. So if it was a network activated plugin, or if it was using the same theme, depending on where the code was. And as far as who has access to reusable blocks, I think I don't have the answer to that question, but I can certainly find out. It's I'm not sure what role would have access, if it might be down all the way to author or contributor maybe, but they would need to have a role that gives them access to create content in that post type, I think. I have not tested that out myself, and that is a great question that I would love to get the answer to share. Any other questions for right now?
Yes, Daisy, we have a question.
Okay.
Can you see in Q&A, or you want me to?
I answered the one that was in Q&A.
Okay, great.
All right. So if there aren't any other questions about this, we can go ahead and move forward to the next section, which are block patterns. So the title of this talk was Extending the Block Editor Even If You Don't Know JavaScript. So in order to fulfill that promise, I did my best to include some things that, while they may require PHP and CSS and HTML, JavaScript is kept to a minimum. There is one item at the end that is actually JavaScript, but me as a non-JavaScript developer, I was able to kind of like see what I needed to do in order to work with it. So I thought it was a good thing to include. So block patterns are very cool. If you have a client who's going to be using a lot of partially configured content that needs to be very precise, like all of the styling, all of the settings for the blocks are going to be set in the code and can be adjusted once you insert it. So there is not a humongous amount of use of this in the marketplace yet, but hopefully that'll be changing over time. But let's go ahead and take a look at what these look like. So block patterns are similar to reusable blocks in the way that they display in the inserter. You have blocks patterns reusable, and the patterns is the middle. Block patterns, however, are actually registered in the code of the plugins or the themes. So it's activated code. And it's basically like a template. We use the word template in other ways in WordPress development level, so we don't call them templates. You could also call them like layouts. It can be as little as a single block or as much as an entire page. So here, let's see. So here we have the large text block pattern that comes with the 2021 theme. You can see in the above the highlighted block, there's 2021 in the dropdown. These are pattern categories, which when we get to a little demo section, you'll see how that works. And this is just a single block that has some font size applied to it, some settings applied to the block, but it's just one block. But this other one, the quote one, which is part of WordPress under the text category, has a number of blocks. We have an image block top that's been set to a style that rounds the image. It's centered. It may even be set to a specific size. The next block down is a quote block. So you have your quote content, and then you have a citation at the bottom, and the styling for these has already been set, or the settings, I should say. And then at the bottom, there is a separator block that has a dot style applied to it. So when you use block pattern, it's going to take those blocks and it's going to stick them into your post content. Once you've done that, they're disengaged from the block pattern. The block pattern is just there as a starting point. Once those blocks are placed into your content, then you can modify them however you like. You can move them around. You can change the content, and they will nothing that you do to the blocks that were added with the block pattern will actually change that block pattern that was used to insert them. So they're good for starting points. So if you had let's say you had a podcast and there were certain elements that needed to be placed on every post, you could have a block pattern to get all those elements in, and then you just have to go through and update it for that specific episode. You know, add your media file, add the specific thumbnail image for that episode, add the notes, but all the blocks to place them would all be there, kind of almost like a form. So let's go ahead and move forward, and let's look at the way that you register a block pattern. This is done with code that is added either in a theme or a plugin. So for example, we could add the code to the active themes functions.php file. In this case, I have a very simple plugin that I created. It's just a single file. It does just block patterns. That's the only thing it registers. So we'll go ahead and go through that code. So here we have the register block pattern category function, which is part of the WordPress API. It is there to add a block pattern category. Similar, it's a little bit like registering a taxonomy for a post type, but as block patterns are not actually a post type, it has its own code. So inside of this function, we have two parameters. We have category name, and we have the properties. And the properties are going to be an array of values. So in this case, the category name is my block patterns. That's basically like the permalink. It's not really a permalink, but it's the ID that WordPress is going to use to identify this. And then the array of properties in this case just has one property, and that property is the label. So you'll see that we've said that it's the label at the front, and then we're saying, and that label is my block patterns. And then the function that surrounds that with the underscores is for localization, so that you have this to be translated into other languages in your translation file for the site. So that is basically how you would register a block pattern category. I recommend this. It's not required. If you would like to be able to have a lot of block patterns, it can get a little overwhelming if they just display in a really long list. So by registering a block pattern and then assigning your patterns those categories, you would be able to keep it a little more organized, a little easier for your users, your content creators to find this stuff. So that was the block pattern category, and they have to actually register the block pattern itself. So here we have the register block pattern function, also part of the WordPress API. We're going to call that in, and in this case we have, let's see, still two parameters. The first is the name. So in this case, we have some kind of a namespace at the beginning, and then a /, and then the name of the pattern. So what I do is I have like a common namespace that I use for all of my block patterns for that site. And then each pattern would have its own name after that. So this is intended to avoid naming collisions with other code on your site. More complex sites might be pulling block patterns in from themes or plugins, and this would prevent you ending up with some really generically named block patterns that could, only one of them would basically if they had the same name. And then, so that's the name, and then we go into the properties, and in this case we have a number of properties. So not every property available is listed here, but the main ones are. So we have title and content are required. So the title that will display in the inserter, in the block editor inserter, would be awesome paragraph. Again, it's a text string, and we want it to be translatable, so I wrapped it in this localization function. And then the content is going to be the HTML markup for the blocks that make up this block pattern. So in this case, we just have one block. It's a paragraph block. You can see that the HTML for a block is opening and closing comments with some information inside that WordPress uses. And then there's some HTML between it, which is actual HTML for the block. So those things all work together. In the case of a paragraph, it's quite simple. When we do some other examples, then you'll see that sometimes the block markup can be quite complex. And so the best way to create these is actually to go into WordPress, into a block editor, build what you want, and then get the code and paste it into your file. So it is a little different for some of us that are used to handwriting our code or doing outside of WordPress as our first step. This is a bit of a change in mentality where we are actually using the block editor. The end tool is being used as the starting tool to create with, which is a little different for a lot of us. So let's see. The other two parameters or properties that I have listed here are description and categories. So description is optional, so are categories. Description, it doesn't actually display anywhere right now, but you'll see it in the examples in the block editor handbook. So I included it here as well. I think it's also keywords is another property that you can use, and then viewport width, which specifies the width of the pattern in the inserter. So it would change the way it displays when you are inserting it. The keywords could be useful. They're used for searching in the inserter. So if you wanted to keep your title short, but you wanted the block pattern to be surfaced with a few other variations of the keywords, then you could include them in a property in the registration code. I could see that being useful if you were going to create a plugin in the repo for other people to use, and you were going to, distribute the code outside to a larger group of people. Those keywords could become very helpful. All right, so let's see if I can get past this. Okay, so now let's look at the code all combined. What we have is the code that we just went over, but we've got some wrapping code, and that's to tell WordPress that we want it to actually happen. So I've created my own function. This can go into functions.php or it can go into a plugin. I'm calling it my register block patterns. The my part is my namespace, so I might make it Daisy. I might make it something of the site's name if it were for a client, something like that. And then, something more generic or more descriptive to explain what that block pattern, what that function is designed to do. That's not to replace documentation in line docs or comments to explain your code, which I do not have here just because it would take up a lot of space in the slide. But that's also a good idea for future you or future other developers to understand what you were thinking when you created the code. So the first thing that I do inside of this function that's going to register my block pattern category and block pattern is to make sure that this can run. So I'm going to make sure that the class WP Block Patterns Registry actually exists on this site. It's always a good idea to put a failsafe like this into your code because things can change. WordPress does try to be backwards compatible whenever possible, but if you were to accidentally install this plugin on a site that was old, for example, pre 5.5, then this code would crash the site if it if it were activated because these functions don't exist yet. So this is just a way to make sure that this is going to be compatible with the site that you're on. And then we're going to throw in our two functions that we created in the previous slides. And then at the end, this can go above it or below it. You'll see both depending on preference. Oops. Let me try that again. We're going to hook our custom function into the init hook in WordPress, and that makes it load very early, and then WordPress will do what it needs to with it because these are API calls. So register block pattern category and register block pattern, WordPress is going to know what to do with that content that's inside there as long as it's formatted correctly. It's going to know what to do to take it and make it available in the site. So these are just building off of what WordPress provides already. So one thing to note is that when you paste your block content into the content property, there may be times where you need to escape characters. It depends. It's a good idea to do it, and I'm going to show a trick that I accidentally stumbled upon to be able to get my block code already escaped, so I can just pop it into the coder. So let's go ahead. I'm going to switch back to my WordPress site. And I had created, this is where we were for team member pattern. So what I'm going to do is, is that right? Yes, so I'm in reusable blocks. So I had previously, for preparation, created this reusable block. And if you're in the reusable blocks list, there is this export as JSON option. And if I go ahead and click that and open the file, make sure it opens in the right program here. Okay, and so you should see Visual Studio Code. Here we have what we exported. And in here we have file and title, which we're not concerned with. We're not going to use those two. But the last piece is content. And it says content at the beginning, because it's JSON, so it's going to be key pairs. And then after the colon, you have all of this markup with the escaped characters already in place. So you get an already escaped version of your block pattern, or it was a reused block, but we can turn it into a block pattern just by pasting this content into the plugin. So this is my plugin. It's just got the header top, the bare information that WordPress requires in order to see it as a plugin. And then you can see here, I've got my add action at the top, and then my register block patterns function. And you could actually have multiple block patterns registered within this same function. But I'm going to take from everything for content after the equal sign and greater than sign all the way end of that line. Up until before the comma, and I'm going to select it and then paste it. It doesn't look like it changed anything because it actually didn't, because I already have the same code in there. But what this will do is it'll make this block pattern available. I'll save it as long as this plugin is active. When I go to create a post, we can go into block patterns and you can see the categories. 2021 is the themes block category. Block pattern categories, buttons, columns, gallery, headers, and text are the ones that WordPress registers. And then at the bottom, we have my custom patterns, which is my pattern that I created. And here you can see, I called it my first block pattern. And it inserts everything ready to go ahead and work with. So a few things to note is that sometimes if you were to, let's say, put an image in here. Okay, and you were to go ahead and update everything. Images tend to have IDs. So if we go into the code editor for this now, this is what all of the block code looks like when it's not all in a single line. But the thing about the media block is that if you look at the code that it uses to generate it, you'll see that you have a media ID, and then it'll be a link. And in this case, the link is my local environment. So if you're going to be doing this on one site and trying to move it to another, you might not want to include the actual media in your block patterns, because IDs and file paths are not going to be the same from one site to the next. it's kind of interesting, I think, to look at the code that generates the blocks, because you can kind of get a feel for what goes into it, where you get so for the media text here, where it opens up block, it includes some of the information that will allow WordPress to dynamically pull in certain aspects of the block. But then for backwards compatibility and also for generating some of the markups on the front end, the HTML exists. So if you were to completely disable the block editor, all those comments would just be in the markup, but they wouldn't display. But all of the HTML in the block, between the comments for the block, would still output to the front end. So it does allow some really good backward compatibility as anything changes with your content. So let's see. So we went ahead and we registered. We actually already did this, registering a block pattern. So are there any questions about block patterns so far? If you have a specific block pattern idea that you want to see if we can build, I'd love to see if we can come up with something. So there's a question, can a block pattern be used as part of a block template? So I'm not entirely sure I understand what you mean by a block template. The block pattern itself is kind of its own thing. It's not something that would be included with something else. When we get further along here and we talk about block styles and block creations, those could be used as part of your block pattern, but not the other way around. So the block patterns kind of stands on its own. And it is a little bit like a template or a layout. Any other questions? A block pattern extend another block pattern. I would say not directly. So you could use a block pattern to build another block pattern that contains some of the same content. When we get to variations and styles, I think you can see that kind of building upon opportunity. You could use if you were not only going to be containing something with a single site, it is possible that you could use a reusable block inside of a block pattern, because a reusable block, let me go ahead and get back to Visual Editor here. I'm going to add a reusable block in here. And if I go into the code now, let me get rid of some of this stuff so that it's simplified. Okay, so now we have this reusable block. If I go back into the code for this, code editor for this, you can see that we still have the group in there and the paragraph. There's an empty paragraph at the end, but the actual reusable block is just this one line where it says WP:block, and then it references the ID of that reusable block. So that is one way that you can use those features together, because you could include the reusable block in your block pattern. It would tie it directly to that one site though, because the reusable block would be content on the site. It is in order for a block pattern to function, the block that is in the code has to exist on the site. So that includes reusable blocks, which are unique to the site that they're added to because they're content. It also could include blocks that are added by themes or plugins. If you have a plugin that adds a block and you use that block in a pattern and then remove the plugin that creates the block, it would alter it. You would only get the HTML portion of it to output, because that's what it will fall back to if WordPress doesn't identify that comment code as a valid block. All right. And if we have no further questions on block patterns, we can move forward to block styles. So block styles are actually quite simple. Oh, let me back up a little bit. Can the content contain PHP code? Not for block patterns. Well, yes, they can, but I would use that if you know what you're doing. So for example, if you were going to, let's say you wanted to populate something in the content with a template tag from that you would use in a theme, like I don't know, maybe the site title or the post title. You could include that in here as a concatenation of the content, and WordPress or the system will parse it as PHP, and then when you pull it in, when you load it in, then it should have that content. But in most cases, I would suggest you try to be careful with including PHP in this. If it's not done correctly, then you could end up with some raw PHP in your content. So I would say, as always, you would want to test everything really well. I think that there are probably some examples out there of block patterns that have some of this, maybe even in 2021. So let's go, maybe just quickly before we move on, let's go ahead and look at the block patterns that 2021 registers. So let me see if I can get this to wrap the content so we can see everything. Okay. And make that a little smaller. Okay. So we have the large text, and you can see if you look in the content here, this here PHP. So it's taking, doing an escape HTML on this string and making it translatable. So that is an example of PHP that could be in the block pattern. And then you can see others. These are all security oriented PHP or translation oriented, so that you can give it a namespace. I'm not sure why you would translate Twitter, Instagram, Dribble. I think those are all brand names, but it's there. And then the escape HTML is there to make sure that there's nothing in there that shouldn't be output to the front end. So, but yeah, if that answers your questions, that is how you would include PHP in a block pattern. Basically, you close out the HTML with a single quote, you put a period to concatenate, you put in whatever PHP you want to include, and then you concatenate again, and then you open up your HTML again. Okay, let's go ahead on that and move forward to block styles. This is a lot of information, so I understand that it might not all sink in on this first round, but hopefully it'll give you some inspiration. Okay, so block styles are a way to add, basically what they do is they add a class name to the block in the markup on the front end and in the editor that then can add CSS to it. It's really that simple. So you can see a couple of examples here. Let's see. So we have the separator block on this site that has 2021 active. It's kind of distinguished by that light green color as the default. There's default that's just going to be a solid separator line. There are dots that will, with some CSS, change that line from the wide default line to 3 dots. And then there's thick, which is similar to default. It's just a little bit taller, I think. And then you can see for the quote styles, there's a large version that just increases the text size. anything that you can apply with CSS, you could apply here. So this is what the code would look to one option. So you can register a block style either with inline styles or by calling in a CSS file. So in this example, we have a function. It looks a lot like the block patterns code in terms of how it's structured. I have my block styles function. This is my own function. And then register block style is the WordPress function, the API function that we're going to use with these parameters with the name. And in this case, the name is the block we want to apply the style to. So in this example, we've got the core quote block. So there's probably in the documentation, the block editor handbook, there's probably a list of all of the blocks that are part of core. And every registered block is going to have a name like this. So you can apply styles to any block as long as you know its name. And then we have properties, and we're going to give it a name. This is basically like an ID name that WordPress will use, my quote. A label. I didn't give it a text domain that I should have, but my quote style, and there should be a comma, and then my plugin or something like that. And then inline style is going to call the selectors. So this first selector is the selector for the block quote. And then the second selector is the selector that this style is going to apply to the block. Is style my quote. So is style is where it starts. That's normal. And then my quote is this ID that I gave it. And then from there, I can go ahead and just give it the CSS. So I set the text color to purple, just as an example. And then I, close everything out. And then at the bottom, I add the action into the init hook so that WordPress loads it along with the block editor. Another example, I should have used my transitions as I went through all that. Forgot about those. Okay. So here is a CSS file instead. So again, we're going to open up our custom function. We're going to register a style. We're going to give that style a name. We're going to tell it where the style file is located. And in this case, I'm going to put it in my style sheet directory, and the file name will be blockstyles.css. You could also use get template directory, but that would not work if you were using a parent-child theme setting, because it would be looking in the parent theme instead of the child theme. So I use style sheet because it gives me the active theme, whether it's a standalone theme or a child theme. And then we are going to register our block style, just as in the last example. We're still using the core quote block, where you've got a name of my quote. We've got a label of my quote style. That's what's going to show up in the block settings panel. And then the style handle is going to be this registered style from the first section. So my block style. I actually do have transitions here. Let me catch us up. Okay. And then you close everything out, and then you hook it into the init hook, just like previous example. And then you would need also your CSS file. So this is just CSS. It sets the color to purple. Again, we have our block quote selector that is part just always there for that block. And then my custom style, which the previous function actually adds into that block. So they're both on the same level, but so for specificity, I would put them together with no space between. Otherwise, it would be looking for a nesting. And then I can continue on down. So I can say I'm going to try to include a quotation. I think that by default it's that before selector is set with some kind of a quote character. So this would change the way that that character looks. And then I can add some padding to the paragraph in the citation. So just basic, your normal CSS that you would use in general. So let's go ahead and look and see what that looks like in a new post. So I need to switch back to visual mode. And now if I add a quote block, and if I actually have registered this, I'm going to go ahead and add a little content. And over here in the right panel for this block, I have default. I have large. Those are the ones that either are part of core or maybe are registered by the theme. And then I have these two custom ones that I just created. So I've got the first one is the inline CSS version. And the second one is the advanced version that pulls in the file. And I can show you where I have that in my custom theme, which is in my functions. Let's see if I put that someplace else. Oh, here's the CSS file. It just changes the color green. Oh, I remember now. Okay, I had separated it to get it all display. Okay, so I've got my register block style section here. So I've got the first example is the inline style, sets the color to purple. And my more complex file-based one registers the style, registers the block style, and then all of this gets added in with the init hook. So that is the basics of how to register a block style. Some of these block styles can be, they could be quite elaborate. So it is possible that you could, let's see what we've got. I think that one thing that's in the 2021 theme specifically is a pattern that's called overlapping images. And when you add that pattern in, and this is how you could be using a combination of a pattern with a block style, you would be able to register that style for one of the blocks that's in that block pattern. So in this case, they have registered a block style called overlap, which makes these images look like they're overlapping. And what's actually happening here is that the columns are overlapping. So you can have, you wouldn't want to use that unless you wanted your content to, text would not be a good choice for this style. And if we change it to the default style, you can see it just goes back to 2 columns. So that's a case where a style and a pattern are used together. One thing about styles, which will distinguish them from variations, is that styles can be applied after the fact. They can be applied after you've inserted them into your content just by toggling. They'll always be available on the block that they're added for. So if you'll see, if I go to the column block, that style goes away. I have to have the block that has the style registered to it in order to see the styles. So if you had variations like, let's say you had, so when we'll get to block variations, you could use register a block variation and then give that block variation multiple styles. So, all right, so there's a question. So yeah, this is a good time to move into questions for block styles. The question in the chat is, why cover block with Why does the cover block not have a link option? You can add a link only in its content, a paragraph or a header. How to link all over cover block. So that's a good question. That would probably be a question for the block editor team. A GitHub issue would be a good place to do that. I don't know the answer to that. It could have just been something nobody thought of it. So let's put our puppy in here as the cover. You could probably trick it into linking with some CSS, but just by putting a link in it and then making it cover the whole area. But yeah, I see what you mean, that you can't just add a link to the cover itself. So, and I could see cases out in real world that could be handy. Any other block style questions? All right, so the last section we have is, get to the right screen here. Did I lose it? Okay, here we go. Oops. Block variations. This is the feature that does require some JavaScript, but what you can do with this, along with the other item, along with block styles, is pretty notable. It can be used as an alternative to block patterns. And after I go through this, then we'll talk about some of the times that you might want to use one versus the other, as long as we have time. So let's dive in. So a block variation is basically you're going to be registering a version of a block that already exists. So it's kind of like a shortcut to creating your own block. So if you get a block the way you want it, and if it's a container block, it can actually contain additional blocks. You can register it as a block variation, and it will actually show up as its own block in the inserter. So in this little snippet, screen, or the image here, you can see that I registered a block variation that's called team listing. And we can go ahead and dig in what that looks like in the code. So the first thing is the PHP portion of this. It's very similar to the other code that we've looked at already. All we're going to do basically is enqueue script into the enqueue block editor assets hook. So we have the function myEditorAssets. And then we're going to enqueue our script. It has a name of myBlockVariations. We're going to tell it where to look for the file, block-variations.js in the theme directory. And then we're going to tell it where to enqueue the script to, which in this case is WP Blocks, so it loads it into the blocker. And then we hook it into the enqueue block editor assets hook in WordPress in the API, and tell it which function to load. So that was the PHP portion. That would go into a plugin or your theme's functions.php file potentially, depending on where you want it to be available. But here is the JavaScript that actually registers block variation. So we start with the JavaScript function, register block variation. That is part of the block editor API. We're going to indicate what block we're going to use as kind of the basis for the variation. So in this case, I'm using a column block as my starting point. So I'm going to say, I want you to load in a column block. And then I want you to name it listing. So it's going to get its own ID and a title to show in the inserter. And then I'm going to set some inner blocks. So I've got the core columns block, and then inside that core column block, I'm going to put these blocks. So I've got two column blocks, and then in each column, I have additional blocks. So it's basically in this case, there are 3 layers of blocks. There's the outer block, which is the one that's going to be inserted by it's going to be added to the inserter by this registration code. But whenever that block variation is used, all these other blocks are going to also come in. You actually see this in Word a lot, even if you don't realize it, because if you have, let's say, the regular columns blocks, you get to choose how many columns you want to have in there. When you choose that, that's a variation. And basically it says, I want 4 columns in this columns block. It adds those 4 column blocks to the columns block, and then it's ready to work with. So that's basically a variation of the one block. So in this case, I have inside my column, my first column, I have a core heading block, and I gave it, I told it level 2, so that's setting it to an H2, and I'm giving it a placeholder text of enter name. The really cool thing about placeholder text is it's not going to actually display that text. So if you're doing something to give a hint of what your content creator is supposed to be doing to complete their portion of the content, these placeholders are really useful for that. And then under that, I have my core image block with no image set, because I would assume that if someone were using this block variation, they would be adding their own image. Now, if you had a block variation that you wanted to always have the same image, you could reference it here and then, you know, build it out with the properties of the block. It's a little bit of like detective work to figure out what these different things are. There is documentation about this in the block editor handbook, that I think there will be a lot more coming, and I could see some additional resources being available between now and when 5.8 becomes available. Second column has a paragraph block with the placeholder of enter bio. So this would be kind of like for a team member area. So you could have an easy way to add a team member to a team page. And then that is our block variation registration. So as you can see, what we have are, it's a little bit like JSON. It's actually object pairs for JavaScript. So we give it there's the name, colon, and then what it is. Title, colon, and then what it is. And it's separated by commas. So I am not really a JavaScript developer myself, but I felt like this was simple enough for me to understand that as long as I follow the structure that's established, then I would be able to extend this on my own. So that is the basics of block variations. Now, if I go back to my WordPress site, I can then load up my blocks and look at the team listing here, and I can insert it, and that's basically what we have. The code that runs that is in my theme file. And so here at the top of my functions.php file, I have my register block variation. It's enqueuing the script, and then it's hooking it into the right place. And then if I want to look at the actual file, I can go in here and see all the blocks that I included in my block variation. So I've got my columns block. I gave it a name, a title. I gave it a scope of inserter. There are a couple of other scopes that you can give it. Inserter puts it in that search in the main inserter as its own block item. I think the other scopes would allow it to be, if you have a block that has a placeholder like the columns block does, that when you first insert it, it shows you the options in the block itself. You could add a scope of block. And then you can, I think there's another one for transform. So the transform functionality of the editor is increasing. So if you have in your block editor, in your block, if you click on the icon for the block, it'll give you options to transform to something different. So in this case, I've got my columns. Columns can transform to a group. So what that would do, I think, is change it so that it doesn't have, it would no longer be a columns block. It looks like it actually just changed, added a group outside of it though. So your mileage may vary. I know that it's something that's being actively developed by the core team to increase the ability to transform from one type of block to another. And also to one thing that they're working on is to be able to transform from a block to a block pattern. So we'll have to see how that develops as we get closer to WordPress 5.8, but it's kind of a cool idea. All right, so here we are back here. My team listing, I gave it an icon. So icon of networking, this uses dash icons. So I can set this icon to any dash icon name, and it'll load that icon. If you don't put an icon in, it's going to inherit the icon from the parent block, which would have been the columns icon. My inner blocks, I extended this just a little bit. I've got 2 headings and an image, a level 2 and a level 3 heading. They both have their own placeholders. And then the second one is just the paragraph with the intro bio. So it's still a relatively simple example. I could see this becoming an extremely powerful tool for as the core blocks become very refined and can do almost everything you need. You could register these variations to mix and match your blocks together into a single block. And that is one way that they are quite similar to block patterns. One thing is that if you're more comfortable with PHP coding, and not so much with digging into the JavaScript that generates these blocks, patterns are a little easier to work with in the beginning. So I felt very comfortable as more of a classic WordPress developer coming in and working with block patterns because it was all code that I understood. Block variations, I can see the power, but it is a little bit of a learning curve for me to transition into working with the JavaScript. So any questions at this point? All right, I do have a question. Is there a reference maintained between a variation used in block editor and the registered variation like it's done for reusable blocks? So if we update the variation markup, will the existing content change too? Let's see if we can find out. All right, let me go ahead and let's get a new post so I don't have all this extra stuff in here. So I'm going to go ahead and add in my team variation. I am going to, let's start by looking at the code that makes it. So we have our columns. It's basically just inserting it just the way that we asked it to. This is a little trick. If you make it, if you insert something into the block editor that has this placeholder set, you can actually save a pattern with the placeholder as well. I actually found that by accident. In some of my workshops that I've done on block patterns, people asked if it was possible to set a placeholder in a block pattern, and I didn't think you could. When I started to learn variations, I found that I could actually do that, which was kind of cool. Great for client work, I think, because you can give clues instead of boilerplate content that has to be completely replaced. So there is nothing in this markup here that attaches it to the variation that was used. So my gut feeling is that you would not see, if I could change to that registration code, which I will do, it would not change the places where that block variation had already been used. But let's see what we get. I'm over here in my block variations JavaScript. Let's go ahead and remove this second core heading. And we're going to save this draft. Problem with trying to hide things so that they don't show on your screen is that you can't use them. Okay, so you can see that H3 that was part of that variation initially is still present. But if I let's get outside of that group. If I go in here again and go to team listing and insert it again, you can see that H3 is no longer there. So it will update it for future uses. But let's do this. Let's register a second block variation. Okay. And in the second one, I'm going to remove that H3. And let's try to add the transform scope. We're going to call this team listing 2. Okay, and then I'm going to add the transform scope here. Okay. This is an experiment, so don't hate me if it doesn't work. Okay, we're going to reload this. Okay, now let's see if I can transform a column block. Okay, so I've got my columns. I'm going to try to transform to, nope, it didn't show up. Let me make sure that I've actually got the right thing in there. Pulling it right might help. Okay, let's see, attributes, scope. It's probably a problem in my use here. So let's say we're not going to allow this to be in the inserter. Let's see if it'll just let me transform it. This is where my limited JavaScript knowledge gets me if I don't have complete documentation. Okay, so now if I go to this columns, let's see if it shows up here now. It does not. There is a scope for transform, but I didn't find it in my initial search. I think I kind of stumbled upon it somewhere along the way. With just another look. So
Daisy, in order to help you,
yes,
you have a typo.
Do I? Thank you.
You have transform in the second block.
Ah, all right. Okay. Well, either way, it should have worked for the first one. So it says, so the scope, there should be one that would allow transform. Block variation will be shown in the component for block variation transformations. So Well, let's change it back to, let's see. Well, let's try it. Maybe I have to add a new one. You're getting a little insight into how I do everything, is see if it works. Okay. Yeah, it'll let me apply styles, and I can go from class to group, but it doesn't. But one thing that I do know works is the block scope. I used this one before. That's what it was. Yeah. And now if I reload this and I add a columns block, you can see my two variations have been added to the placeholder variations. So the placeholder variations are not used all that often in core. Columns is one. I think, I don't know, the image might be one. You might be able to do one with image. But you see these like, this is ready for further configuration. There isn't enough information for WordPress to determine what you wanted to do. So it's giving you these options. So now, because I changed it to block as the scope, it will not show up in the inserter panel. So theoretically, if I understand this, it may not. I can save this. And let's see if it shows up in both places now. There's my team listing, both of my variations. And then if I change this to columns and insert it, then I also have the team listings here too. So I'm not sure what's going on with the transform version. I have not seen any working examples of that so far with variations. So it's something I'm gonna probably look into and ask some people that are more knowledgeable than I am about it. So I feel like we're just, are we about at time?
Yes, we are fine.
Okay. I guess I timed it well then.
Great.
So just to wrap things up, we talked about, well, first we talked about reusable blocks. Then we talked about block patterns. The block patterns are available from the Patterns tab in the main inserter. They give you a preview of the pattern. They can be either partially or fully configured via code, depending on your needs. Block styles adds a class to a block. It's applied to a single block, although you can trickle it down or use CSS to also apply things to inner blocks. And can be accessed from the block settings sidebar. And it's easy to change from one style to another on any block that has multiple styles available. Block variations displays as its own block or potentially in the block placeholder after insertion. I think the more common use would be for it to display as its own block. It can be partially or fully configured, just like block patterns, though the code is quite different. It does require some JavaScript. And that is it. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining me today. And I know that it was a lot of information, and there's always a lot of trial and error in these things. But I think that these are 3 ways that even without a ton of JavaScript, or maybe if you're a little intimidated by the idea of React in general, as I am myself, it's a pathway in. I felt like when I discovered block variations, it kind of unleashed something for me. And I think that I'm going to be able to take what I've learned so far with block variations and then apply it to other ways to work with the block editor. And as a former site builder, I can see some really big opportunities where I've used this in my work.
Great. Your presentation was really great, Daisy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Με τους υπόλοιπους, σας ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ που ήσασταν μαζί μας. Μπορείτε να πάτε σε κάποιο άλλο session και ακολουθούν τα closing remarks για το φετινό μας συνέδριο. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ που ήσασταν μαζί μας. Καλή συνέχεια. Bye.